Hey everybody, this is Mr. Carden here. We're going to be talking about the Civil War today. Now, the Civil War is one of those topics in U.S. history that people often like to talk about. A lot of people want to hear about the battles and they want to hear, about the types of weaponry that were used and all of that. And if that's you, I'm sorry. That's not what this lesson is going to be about today. We have to hit the highlights, and the highlights that we have to hit are things that are going to move us closer to what's going on in the 1890s through the 1900s and what's taking place today and how the Civil War still impacts us. So, we have two big ideas that we need to focus on. First, what advantages did the North have over the South during the Civil War? There are going to be quite a few, and we'll talk about them. And how did these advantages help to shape the war? Number two, what lasting impact did the Civil War have on the country? There are still things today that are evident that impact us because of what happened during the Civil War. So, our two key terms are the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. Now, to be able to talk about the Civil War, we have to know why the Civil War happened in the first place. Most historians will tell you that it's largely about one thing with a few little causes, and then there are a few historians that will tell you that slavery didn't have very much to do with it. I disagree with those historians completely. So, economy. The Southern economy depended on cotton and consequently on slave labor. So the South was warm enough and had the right climate, the right soil to be able to grow a lot of cotton. And to grow it better than really anywhere in the world at that time. So throughout the 1700s and into the early 1800s in particular, cotton was king in the American South. And because of this, this is how so many Southern Americans made their living. But in the North, they couldn't grow it. And so they focused on industry and on other types of agriculture. States' rights versus federal rights is another cause of the Civil War. The southern states wanted to be able to nullify federal acts. So, if you have a larger population in the North, which you did, and we'll talk more about that later, then they often had a little more power than the South. And the South wanted to be able to say, hey, we're the state of Virginia or we're the state of Mississippi, and we don't like this law that's being passed. We are going to nullify it or get rid of it within our own state. Federal rights are going to be having federal power or country power. When you hear that word federal, we're talking about the nation as a whole. Okay? Slavery. Slavery is the big one. This is a broad category that contains two contributing factors, slave and non-slave states, and the growing abolitionist movement in the North. Now, slavery is the one that, without slavery, we probably never would have had a civil war. So, it's big. And then the catalyst, the thing that sets this all off, is the election of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was the first Republican elected to president or to the presidency. He won the North, and his opponent won the South. The country was divided because of this. So the Civil War began when Confederate soldiers fired upon Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina on 4/12/1861. So we're talking about right over here in South Carolina. Okay? Now, after the battle at Fort Sumter, several more states left the Union. Now, several of these southern states had left the Union already, but we've got some of these that decide to leave after. But there were four states that decided to stay in the Union: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, and then later West Virginia would be formed out of the western part of Virginia. The Confederacy believed that Great Britain would help them, due to the southern U.S. being the primary cotton producer in the world. They thought that Great Britain was just going to keep relying on them, but what they weren't paying attention to was that Great Britain was also now getting a lot of its cotton from India and from Egypt. And Great Britain had a ton of control in those areas at that time. So it was much easier for them to just purchase from those areas. Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863, and it stated that all slaves in slave states were to become free. Now, this didn't account for those in slave states that were in the Union, and we'll talk a little more about that later. Due to large numbers of desertions, both sides had to turn to conscription, which is a draft that forced men to serve in the army. So, draft is the word that we often think of today. When we talk about a group of men that are gathered into the army, they're selected at random, and then they have to serve. There were many people in the North at the time who were angry over the conscription. Now, one of the reasons that they were so angry is many of the people that were angry were people who had not been in the United States very long. The Irish and other Europeans had come over by the millions. And as they had come over, they had been treated as second-rate citizens. And so they had not been given a lot of the freedoms or job opportunities that many other Americans that had been here were given. So they were upset that they now had to go and fight in a war when they weren't given equality. So we're going to talk about northern strengths and southern strengths. And northern strengths outweigh the southern strengths. It's one of the reasons that the North won the war. Now, I'm only going to show you 4 right here, but there are many, many more than this. So let's look right here. In the North, 71% of the population lives in the Union, and 29% lives in the Confederacy. So 71% of the population. So basically, we've got 7 men to every 3 men fighting in the war, okay? If you want to look at it that way. So if you got a street fight and 7 guys are fighting against 3, generally those 7 are going to win. Now, railroad mileage. And to us, we may not think much about railroad mileage because we don't ride on trains. But back then, it was a major source of transportation. But not just for people. Yes, we did need to be able to move people from point A to point B. But this is how people got most of their goods from point A to point B as well. This is how the North moved their food. This is how the North moved their guns and their ammunition. So this played a key role. Manufacturing plants. Now these next 2 are going to be pretty big. So if we look here, 86% of the manufacturing plants in the country were in the Union. So most of the things that were produced were being made in the North. This is guns, this is ammunition, this is uniforms, this is boots, things that would be essential for a soldier to have. And then industrial workers. 92% of the workers working in industry are in the North. So just one more thing to set the North aside from the South. Okay, we could also add in banks and how much wealth was in the North. Southern strengths. The South had many well-trained military personnel. Over here on the right, we have General Robert E. Lee, who was highly considered, one of the best generals in American history. The South was also fighting to maintain its way of life. They wanted to continue being able to do what they have been allowed to do since, the country had been created. They didn't like that people who didn't even live near them were telling them what they could and couldn't do. They were also fighting on their own soil. And when you're protecting your own turf, your own territory, you have a little more to fight for. And access to King Cotton. Cotton was still important. Although they weren't able to trade in larger quantities with Great Britain than they were before, they still needed this cotton production. And the Southern objective was easier than the North's. The South only needed to stop the invasion of the Northerners, whereas the North was fighting to protect the Union. So, if they're going to do that, the North has to come into the South's turf and win. Now, both sides believed they would win the war when it began. Early Confederate victories like those at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, both in Virginia, gave the South confidence early in the war. But over time, the North began to win the majority of the battles, and it took a toll on the Confederate Army. The Confederacy didn't have all of the ammunition they needed and all of the quality guns that they needed, and they didn't have all of the uniforms that they needed. And over time, they began to be worn down. Confederate General Robert E. Lee decided that he needed to do something more. So he decided to move north to take the fight into Union territory. The most decisive battle of the war was fought in Union territory at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It was a 3-day battle that seemed to seal the fate of the Confederacy. It ended with a Union victory, but it had a catastrophic loss of life for both sides. So in this one battle, we have 23,000 Union casualties and 28,000 Confederate casualties. In November of 1863, Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, something which I bet most of you have heard before. This helped many to see that the U.S. wasn't just a collection of states, but one united nation, if they could get the South back, as part of the Union. That would, help to unify everything again. After more Confederate defeats, like Vicksburg and Sherman's March, the South had been worn down. They didn't have what they needed to produce their goods anymore. Many of their farms had been destroyed and couldn't grow crops in the quantities that they needed to. They were struggling. So General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1965. 1865. This brought an end to the 4-year-long Civil War. 360,000 Union soldiers died fighting in the war. So, with 360,000, I need us to think about that, for instance. There are less people living in Little Rock than that. There are around 200,000 that live in the city of Little Rock. And then 260,000 Confederate soldiers died fighting in the war. Altogether, the loss of life in the Civil War is greater than the American loss of life in World War II, World War I, Vietnam, and Korea. So we are talking about a massive loss of life for the American population. It helped to increase federal authority as well. So during the Civil War, a law on income tax and conscription were passed, giving the country more power. And after the Civil War, no state ever seriously threatened secession again. We have people in certain states, I won't mention any names, Texas, that think that, they should succeed or could succeed. But no state has ever seriously done this again. All right. The Civil War increased the economic gap between the North and the South. This is something that we see today. A large portion of the poorest states in the United States are in the South, places like Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, whereas a lot of your wealthier states are in the North, places like New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. Northern industry boomed after the war, so things just got better for the North, but the South struggled. Without slavery as a source of labor, most plantation owners, had to find something out or find out a new way to make wealth. And so they struggled. The South had much of its infrastructure, industry, and farmland destroyed. So if you don't know what infrastructure is, we're talking about roads and bridges and railroads and buildings. A lot of things were destroyed, and so they had to be rebuilt to even get back to where they were before. Industry, a lot of factories. The few factories that were in the South, many of them were destroyed. And much of the farmland had been torn up. It led also to the freeing of slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation declared freedom only for slaves in the South. Those that were in states like Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia, those border states, their slaves were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. But in 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, and it declared slavery unconstitutional in all American states and territories. On April 14th, 1865, just 5 days after Appomattox Courthouse, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated while watching a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He was killed by a Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth. Now, President Lincoln was murdered 5 days after Lee signed his surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Just a little repetition for you. I guess that means it's super important. All right, Lincoln was the first of 4 presidents to be assassinated, but there have been assassination attempts on the lives of at least 15 presidents. All right, y'all. If you have any questions about the Civil War, you can always shoot me a message or send a message to your teacher. I hope everything's going well, and have a great day. Bye.